So, hello, thank you. Thank you for not booing. So, my name is Lynne Murphy. I am, in my day job, a professor of linguistics, and I'm also, in the rest of my life, an American who has lived in Brighton for 20 years. And I started this talk several years ago, gave it as a 15-minute talk in Brighton, and then I gave it as a 45-minute talk, and then I gave it as an hour-long talk, then it became a book. So what you're going to see here is I kept learning more stuff, and there's way more stuff than I can say tonight, but you'll see a little bit of a taste of what I hope we'll get some questions. So I've come here, to this country that welcomed me with leave to remain, and started to face these kinds of headlines. British children turn to American English like you turn to a life of drugs and prostitution. BBC criticized for creeping Americanisms, right? Americanisms need to take a rain check. Americanisms are garbage that mangle English. This was an article that was in the BBC magazine some time ago, and it was 50 of your most noted examples. They asked people to write in with what are the Americanisms that you're noting. Anywhere where this got quoted later in the press, it was 50 of your most hated Americanisms, and that's pretty much what the article was about. And then Matthew Engel, who wrote one of the other articles here, came out with this book shortly before my book came out about the American conquest of English. And I like to think about people in the Pentagon sitting around board tables and planning, how are we going to get them to say sidewalk? But anyway. And then things like this, So I did a recent study of listicles about language, and the ones you get in America about British English, these 72 things, whatever. The American ones are all 72 British phrases you should start using now, and British slang words that are absolutely the tops. But then you get 41 things Americans say wrong. So that's what I was faced with, and I had a name for it. It's Anti-Americanism, right? A prejudice against American words. And where you've got a prejudice, you've usually got some fear, right? Yeah. So that fear I call Amerilexicophobia, right? The fear of American words. But it goes further than that. It gets rather pathological, and can turn into Amerilexicosis. And so I'm going to give you an example of Amerilexicosis now. So it gets to the point where people are hallucinating Americanisms. So we get things like this. This was one of the articles I showed, BBC criticized for creeping Americanisms, and this was a sidebar in the article. These are the only 7 Americanisms that are mentioned in the article, except that only 4 of them are actually Americanisms. So, face up instead of confront, that goes back to Daniel Defoe, that at least he's the first example of it in the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. It's never not been used in British English since then. It's a big ask. Does anybody know? Australian. I only learned it when I moved here. And I went right home and I looked it up in a dictionary, which is more than the Telegraph did. And then it might have been instead of it might have been, which is an error, right? It's taking the contracted form might have and misunderstanding it as OF and misspelling it, right? Now, one of my questions was, how did people listening to BBC Radio know that the newsreaders were misspelling this contraction? But the other problem with this is that disliking a bit of English is not enough to make it American, which is what we had in those last 3 cases. So if you take, furthermore, Americans are not actually that bad at English. So if you look at who spells apostrophe VE as of. This is looking at English on the web. And you can see it's the GB column that is statistically most likely to use that misspelling. You can look at the same data in a different way. It's a bit blurry. But basically what you need to know is the darker the blue, the more statistically associated with a particular place that number is. And you can see Americans are statistically associated with spelling it right, and not the British. So but we get that again and again. That things that people write into the editors about are very often not Americanisms, even though they're claimed to be Americanisms. Sometimes, like there was one person that wrote into the Spectator of the Week, I can't remember, who complained about, if you're going to call them train lines instead of railway lines, well, number one, Americans don't call them train lines, they call them train tracks, then you might as well start saying wind sheeter instead of anorak, which as far as I know, nobody's ever called it a wind sheeter in the world. A wind cheater, yes, but that's Britishism. Americans call them windbreakers. So you get these things again and again in the press representing this scary thing that is American English, except misrepresenting it. So that's why I wanted to talk about how America saved the English language. And I've got 3 ways that America saved the English language. Starting out with America saved the English language by not changing it. Okay, so we've got lots and lots of examples of that. If we start with David Mitchell, looking much younger than he does on the television now, he did a series of podcasts or video podcasts for The Guardian. And one of them was called A Letter from the Queen. And it was a letter from the Queen to America to tell Americans that the Queen didn't mind at all that Americans used their own English, except for a few things. And one of them was that Americans say titbit, because the Americans, think the syllable tit is intrinsically rude. Okay? So Americans say tidbit with a D, British people say titbit with a T, and why is that? Well, because tidbit was the original word. The original word tid meant a small precious thing, or it meant a precious thing, so a tidbit was a small thing that was precious. And the word went over to America, stayed tidbit, but changed to tit in Britain. So it says tidbit is now chiefly in North America. This is part of something of a pattern, because the English really like to change other words to tit. Okay? And then once I realized this, it sort of explained page 3 to me. So lots of tit saying in Britain. Another example coming to us from Mr. Mitchell is herb. Now I say herb now because it's just too much of a pain to explain this every time. But really, you're French now is the question. It's like, no, I'm English. Because in Middle English the word was herb, no H. And then in the 15th century, the scribes, was it 15th century? The 17th century. The scribes who knew Latin and who knew that Latin had an H in this word started writing the H in. Similar to the fact that the word debt has a B now, because some scribe somewhere thought, oh, but there's a B in Latin debit, we better have a B too, even though nobody ever pronounced it. So these scribes are doing things because they want to be fancy in Latin. But it wasn't until the 19th century, so 400 years later, that anyone started pronouncing the H in herb in England. By this time, the ships had sailed to America, so all the herb sayers went over there. Okay? But the H was mute to the 19th century. Why the 19th century? Well, this is an 1855 cartoon from Punch, where, I beg your pardon, ma'am, but I think you dropped this. Because H dropping had become a big signal of social class. Everybody used to drop H's, but then the fancy people stopped. And so they started adding in H's where they hadn't even been before. So tits and class. That's the British English class. Americans saved a lot of other things that are Americanisms Some of them were invented in America, obviously, but a lot of things came over from England, or possibly from other parts of the British Isles. So Americans say farmer, mostly, rather than farmer, because those R's were spelt there because they used to be there, right? And then in the southeast, they went away and then pushed the R's out of the rest of England. Secretary, also an innovation since the 18th century. Grammatical forms. So the subjunctive form. So to say, I suggested that he write to you, rather than he writes to you or he should write to you. That's called the mandative subjunctive form. Lived on in America, died out completely by the turn of the 20th century in Britain. If you hear this in Britain now, it's because Americans preserved it, took care of it, and then reintroduced it into the world. You know, just like the beavers in Scotland. You know, so a bit of saved stuff. Various words that you'll think of as American started in Britain. British people stopped saying them. And various meanings. So using mad to mean angry came over from England. Using smart to mean clever came over from England. And then those meanings of those words got pushed out more and more by new meanings in England. So that's one way that America saved the English language, by preserving things. Another way is by where things changed, it was often in the direction of Englishiness, which is, you know, a prominent word. So I like to think of British English as being sort of Franglish. That even though you've had 200 years wars against French, against the French, you know, they're still the cool kids. They're still who you want your language to look like. So take, for example, the story of this word, schedule or schedule. So originally this word was sedule. There was no CH in it, and it was pronounced sedule. And then for some reason, people started writing it with a CH. I think they started in France. And that became stylish. And then in the 18th century, there was a big boom in pronunciation dictionaries. People were because received pronunciation was starting to develop, or what would be received pronunciation was starting to develop. And so people were very concerned about how should we pronounce words. And so they had debates about it, and people were on both sides. So should we pronounce it like ska, because that's how we pronounce that sound in scheme and in school and in lots of other English words? Or should we pronounce it like the French are doing? And we know how that turned out. The British went with how the French are doing it, and the Americans went with, well, let's go with how we pronounce these letters elsewhere in English. The U in honor, and the U in labor, and the U in color, and all those U's are there because the words came over with the with the Normans, who became Anglo-Normans. And when the Normans came over, nobody was spelling things very stably. So it came over with a U and without a U and stuff. And so in the 15th century, when it was being used in earnest in English, they were spelling it all kinds of ways. By the time Shakespeare comes along, it's still unsettled. Okay, so there are more honors without a U than honors with a U in Shakespeare's first folio. After Johnson's dictionary, there were still other dictionaries. Johnson's dictionary was 1755. After that, there were still other British dictionaries spelling it without the U, because the U is not pronounced. The Latin etymology has no U, so it comes from a Latin word that has no U. And also, when you derive it into other forms, it often doesn't have a U. So you have to remember, do I need a U in honorific or not? Do I need a U in honorable or not? And that's because some of these words came from Latin and some of them came from French. So the British decision was, well, French is classy. We associate French with royalty. We associate French with the good life. Let's keep the U. Whereas the Americans said, we don't want kings anymore. We don't want aristocracy anymore. Let's get rid of these U's. So that kind of thing. Didn't mean to go all the way back. That kind of thing, again, is American English being a bit more like how English is in its heart, how it's pronounced, where it's come from, than British. And the last way that the last way that American English has had a hand in saving English is that English would not be the language it is today worldwide if it were not being spoken by 360 million Americans. So occasionally you see the opinions like this in the paper that maybe American English is doing something good. So if you look at the countries where English is an official language or is spoken almost universally, it's the orange ones that are speaking it a lot, and it's the green and blue ones where it's official languages. In those places, English is very much there because of the British Empire, right? It went there, it planted English, and for better or worse, it stayed. And in the orange ones, it's because of the EU, a lot of it, partly. But also, we've got all of this of the world learning English, so that 1 billion people speak English now, because English is an economically important language to have. And that is in large part due to the American influence on the world economy in the 20th century. So the 19th century was British English's century. The 20th century was American English's century in terms of spreading around the world. And the 21st century is going to be the Chinese English century or something else, right? Okay. Nevertheless, the BBC is saying that Americanisms are killing the English language, that English language that 1 billion people are speaking, practically dead, So I'd like to just sort of end by busting a few myths about what is happening with British English and American English, because people do fear that we're going to lose our Britishness because people are saying sidewalk, or because people are saying movie, or things like that. So I want to reassure you that actually it's not happening. You notice some words, yes, but in the main, our accents are getting more different. If you look at the way that young people in Britain speak today, it has very little to do with how anybody in America is speaking. The grammar, some trends are the same, some trends are different, but in the main, our grammar is the same anyway. What it is, what people are looking at when they study this is things like, are people using the passive more than they used to, or less than they used to? And Americans have been using it less, and now British people are using it less too. So it's not that the grammar's changed, it's style. Writing style is changing. Spelling is getting more different, I would say. And here's one of my examples. So this is the IZE suffix in British publications. This is from the data that the Collins English Dictionary uses to decide on their definition. And in around 1990, where you had a choice between ISE and IZE, nearly 80% of them were Zs. It was in newspapers like the Times, it was in British publishers' books. But then around 1995, it just bottoms out. And nowadays, the people who I teach, who were born after this, they just know IZE as being the American spelling. But until very recently, British English allowed both. And the IZE is the first spelling in the Oxford dictionaries. It's what's called Oxford spelling. And so what's happened here? I would say what's happened here is spell check. So this is where spell check came into our lives. And where people started going, I spell it with an S, and now Microsoft wants me to spell it with a Z. It's those evil Americans. And the thing about spell check is spell check does not like ambiguity. It wants one or the other. And so it was easy at this point to decide we're going to go with one, and the one we're going to go with is the one that isn't the American one. Because God forbid you be mistaken for an American. So the language is doing pretty well, and where we do have overlap is vocabulary, and that vocabulary, this is a book that was published before I was born, which actually was only the year after this was published, so a long time ago, more than 15 years ago. We have this book that says, you know, English is changing, and pretty soon British people are going to be saying movie, elevator, can't, and meet up with, because everybody's worried about that. Okay? And, you know, fast forward, well, I haven't updated the sign since 2018, but update that to 2019, and we've got British people still saying film. They say movie too, but the meanings for those are slightly different. You don't tend to go in elevators, but Americans are going in lifts more and more because British English is cool. And you don't eat canned tomatoes, do you? You eat tinned tomatoes. So all these things that were just about to change in the 1960s haven't changed that much. So another book that came out shortly after my book by Paul Baker, who's a professor at Lancaster University. I recommend my book if you want jokes. I recommend his book if you want long discussions of which statistical tests are better than other statistical tests for linguistic data. It's a very good book. But what he decided, he asked a computer to look at it. And instead of saying, am I hearing people saying movie more because I heard somebody said that, he looked at all the words and found that the two nations are maintaining their differences. You're not, you know, putting things in the trunk of your car or driving on the highway. You know, you're still doing the things you do. Okay? Even when words are coming over, so you've got the British now use the word cookies. This is a picture from the shop Ben's Cookies. There are differences. So, and there is resentment, because do you remember a few years ago when Blue Peter asked its viewers to name the new cat, and they came up with cookies, and the BBC interfered and changed its name to socks. So the word's coming over, and not everybody's happy about it, but I say you can't be happy about it because it's not the American word you're using. It's the British word cookies you're using. Because if it were the American word, it would refer to these things, which you call biscuits. And it would refer to these things, which you probably call cakes. And it would refer to these things, which you call rolls. And it would refer to these things, which you call tray bakes, but we call bar cookies. And this is an Italian wedding cookie. All right? You're not using the word cookie the same way that Americans are. You've taken it, you've made it your own, so you should enjoy it. Any way you want to. In the end, it's not that American English has gone and changed British English. It's that American English and British English of today have a common ancestor and have both changed for hundreds of years now, separately, and done their own thing. So neither is better. In any way, it's not a contest. Neither is older. Both are wondrous. I enjoy them both very much, and I hope you do too. And if you would like to know more, I have bought a few copies of the book with me, and the best thing about this one is it says Economist Book of the Year on the front. That's my little plug. So I do have a few copies for £10 if anyone's interested. But since I'm first in the evening, you're probably not drunk enough yet. So thank you very much.